Today we're tackling a topic that really shook things up back in 1704 London.
Ooh, London.
Yeah.
I love it.
It's divine providence and this idea of whether nature even exists.
Okay.
And specifically, we're going to be looking at Rabbi David Nieto's On Divine Providence,
Right.
which dives headfirst into that question.
So what makes this so interesting is this wasn't just some theoretical debate, in some back room somewhere. This was something that really stirred up a lot of controversy in the Jewish community in London.
Yeah, and we've got excerpts from Rabbi Nieto's text here.
Right.
And he makes a pretty radical argument against the whole idea of a universal independent nature.
Yes.
And instead, he's putting the focus on God's direct governance through providence,
Right.
which has some pretty big implications for us today.
Absolutely. And I think as we kind of unpack some of Nieto's arguments, you'll see how they connect to some of the modern debates that we have, you know, in terms of science and religion.
Right.
We're almost time traveling back to the 18th century. Totally.
To get some, some perspective that's actually surprisingly relevant for today.
Okay, let's set the scene.
Right.
So we're in London
Okay.
in the early 1700s.
Yes.
And this is a time when scientific discoveries are all the rage, guys like Isaac Newton.
Right.
And Rabbi Nieto, he delivers this sermon that sends shockwaves through the community.
I can't imagine.
He claims that there's no Hebrew word for nature,
Wow.
and he argues that God alone governs the world.
Can you imagine the uproar?
Yeah.
I mean, just the audacity to kind of challenge something that people consider to be so fundamental to their understanding of the world. It's like he dropped a philosophical bomb right in the middle of London's Jewish quarter.
It's like, whoa, hold on, time out. And it doesn't stop there.
Right.
So this prominent member of the congregation, Joshua Zarfati, he accuses Nieto of promoting pantheism.
Oh, wow.
Essentially saying that he's blurring the lines between God and nature.
So to defend himself, Nieto publishes his arguments in a book the very next year.
Wow, so he doubles down.
Yeah, he's like, okay.
All right, so this is going to be a written debate now, not just a sermon.
Yeah, so it's like throwing fuel on the fire.
Absolutely.
And to settle this dispute, another prominent rabbi steps in, Rabbi Chesvi Ashkenazi.
Okay.
And ultimately, he sides with Nieto.
He does.
Drawing upon sources like the Kuzari to support the idea that attributing governance to a separate nature actually diminishes God's role.
Right. It's like you're giving away some of God's power to this other entity.
So we've got these two clashing worldviews, right?
Yeah.
On one side, we have the perspective of someone like Zarfati,
Okay.
who believed that nature governs the world according to these fixed laws. We'll call that perspective Simon for the sake of this deep dive.
Okay, I like it.
And Simon relies on biblical verses and Talmudic saying to back up this view.
Okay.
He sees nature as this independent, well-oiled machine, set in motion by God.
Right. And for Simon, miracles are those moments when God has to kind of step in and, maybe hit the pause button in this natural order to make something extraordinary happen.
It's like a break in the matrix.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, whoa, how did that happen?
Then we have Rabbi Nieto's perspective, which we'll call Reuben.
Okay.
And Reuben argues that nature is a much more modern concept.
Okay.
And for him, traditional Jewish thought is all about God's direct involvement in the world.
So really hands-on, not some distant deity.
Yeah. And Reuben hammers home the point that miracles themselves are proof that God can override any perceived natural order.
Right. It's like the evidence right there that you can't box God in.
Totally. And so in his view, there's no separate nature calling the shots.
Nope.
It's all God.
It's God all the way down.
Okay. So I'm starting to see this divide here. But Reuben doesn't just reject the idea of nature outright. He goes deeper. He tries to unpack what people actually mean when they use that word.
He's not just trying to win a debate. He's trying to really understand what's going on.
Right. He's like, okay, what do you mean by this?
Yeah.
So he breaks down nature into three distinct categories.
Okay.
Individual, specific, and general.
Okay.
So individual nature refers to what makes each individual unique. So like your personality traits or even your fingerprints.
Right, what makes you.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then there's specific nature, which refers to the shared traits of a species.
All right.
So all dogs bark.
Right.
Or all birds have feathers.
Got it.
And then general nature is this broader category, like the fact that animals need to eat.
Okay, so he's kind of creating a taxonomy.
Yeah.
Of nature.
Yeah, it's whoa, okay, hold on. We need to define our terms here. But then he drops this bombshell. He's like, okay, I've broken it down for you, but only individual nature is actually real.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's like, the other two, specific and general nature, are just abstract concepts that we've created to try to make sense of the world.
That's a bold statement.
Yeah.
So he's saying that we're taking this idea of nature and we're imposing a human-made construct on reality.
Totally. And it's like, okay, if there's no separate controlling force called nature, how does God actually govern the world?
Right. That's the question.
So he's laid the groundwork.
Yeah.
And now I'm really curious to hear how he answers that.
Me too.
What does God's direct governance look like in his view?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting.
Well, don't leave me hanging.
All right.
We'll dive into that in part 2.
Welcome back. I know you're on the edge of your seat wanting to hear how Reuben explains God's direct governance.
Totally.
And, we're not talking about some distant, hands-off deity. He sees God being involved in, literally every aspect of creation.
But even those things we think of as just like the way the world works, like rain falling from the sky, the sun rising every morning, Reuben would say that God is directly behind those actions.
That's exactly right. He even uses the example of God covering the sky with clouds and sending rain to make this point.
Wow.
We might think, oh, that's just the weather doing its thing.
Right.
But Reuben's like, nope, that's God, actively orchestrating the flow of water across the planet.
I've never thought about it like that before.
And he points to Jewish texts that really emphasize this idea of God's constant involvement in every tiny detail of creation, from the tiniest atom to the vast expanse of the universe.
It's not like he said it and forget it.
Exactly. It's not like a watchmaker who winds it up and lets it go. It's more like, God is the ever-present force animating everything.
What about angels? Because Jewish tradition talks about angels having dominion over certain parts of creation.
Right.
Does Reuben just ignore that whole concept?
He doesn't deny the existence of angels, but he makes this crucial distinction that they're simply carrying out God's will.
Okay.
So they're like messengers or agents of God's power.
So it's like God is the CEO, and the angels are like the managers carrying out specific tasks.
That's a great analogy.
Okay.
And he uses the story of the 3 youths in the fiery furnace to illustrate this point.
Right.
Remember that angel Gabriel protected them from the flames?
Yeah, of course.
Well, Reuben says Gabriel was acting as God's direct representative, not as an independent force with power over fire.
Okay, so God is the ultimate source of authority.
Exactly.
But if God is so involved in every little detail, does that mean we're just puppets on strings?
Right. That's the big question.
Do we have any free will at all?
That's the age-old debate. And Reuben actually offers a framework for understanding how God's active governance and human agency can coexist. He outlines 3 degrees of providence to explain how God's involvement plays out on different levels.
Okay, lay it on me. What are these 3 degrees of providence?
Okay, so the first degree is what he calls universal providence. And this is the foundational level operating through fixed, unchanging laws.
Okay.
So think about the laws of physics or the cycle of the seasons. Those are those constant, predictable patterns that create order.
So universal providence is the background hum of God's governance.
Exactly, making sure the universe runs smoothly.
Got it. What about the other 2?
Okay, so the second degree is called private hidden providence, and this is where things get a little more mysterious.
Okay.
This is the idea that God works through seemingly accidental events to guide individuals or groups towards a specific outcome.
So those moments that feel like pure chance, like missing a flight that ends up crashing or bumping into someone who completely changes the course of your life, Reuben would say, that's God.
He might say there's a deeper purpose at play, even if we don't understand it at the time. Those seemingly random events are actually part of a divine tapestry woven together by God's hand.
Okay, that's private hidden providence, and what's the third?
The third is miraculous providence.
Okay.
This is the most dramatic level where God directly intervenes in the natural order.
So parting of the Red Sea, the miracles performed by prophets in the Bible, those moments where it's whoa, something supernatural just happened.
Exactly. Those are instances where God's power breaks through to accomplish something extraordinary.
So by outlining these 3 levels of God's involvement, he's explaining how divine action and human choice can kind of work together.
Yeah, it's not either.
It's both hand.
Okay, this is starting to make more sense. But if God is so involved, why bother taking any precautions in life?
Okay.
Why build armies if God ultimately decides the outcome of battles?
Well, Reuben tackles this head on.
Okay.
He explains that while God can perform miracles, He chooses not to do so constantly.
Okay.
He wants to maintain the natural order he established.
Right. The one that allows for human agency and free will.
So it's not a case of just sitting back and expecting God to do everything for us.
Exactly.
We still have to make choices, take action, and live with those consequences.
It's about recognizing that our actions have consequences.
Right.
But also acknowledging that there's a larger plan unfolding that we might not fully grasp.
Okay, this brings us to another interesting aspect of Reuben's thinking.
Yes.
The role of the Holy Land and this concept of mazal, which is often translated as luck or fate.
Right.
Does God's providence work differently in the Holy Land?
That's a great question.
And how does mazal fit into all of this?
So Rabbi Nieto argues that God's providence is particularly active in the Holy Land.
Okay.
And he draws on biblical verses that describe it as a place under God's constant watchful eye.
So the Holy Land is like a focal point for God's attention.
Mm-hmm.
What about this mazal thing?
Okay.
Does it mean our lives are predetermined? Are we all just following a script written by God?
Mazal is a complex concept, but Reuben seems to interpret it as kind of a divine blueprint for each individual, established at the moment of conception.
So like a pre-programmed destiny?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Remember, Reuben's all about God's constant dynamic involvement.
Right.
He suggests that righteous actions can actually alter this predetermined plan, especially for the people of Israel.
So there's still room for free will and personal growth.
Exactly. Think of Mazal as a starting point.
Okay.
A set of potentials and challenges.
Okay.
But through our choices, especially through living a righteous life, we can influence the course of our lives and even shift that initial trajectory.
So it's not about being locked into a predetermined fate.
Nope.
But about understanding we have the power to shape our own destinies in partnership with God.
That's a key point. We're not alone in this journey. God is actively involved, guiding us, supporting us, and responding to our choices.
That makes a lot of sense.
But this raises another question. If God is so involved, why do bad things happen even to good people?
Right. Like, where does suffering fit into this picture?
That's a question that has haunted humanity for centuries.
Yeah, and it feels especially relevant right now with all the challenges and uncertainty we're facing in the world.
Absolutely. And it's a question that Reuben doesn't shy away from.
Okay.
He addresses it by reminding us of the hidden nature of private providence.
Okay.
Sometimes God allows things to happen that seem negative on the surface, but ultimately serve a greater purpose.
So it's about trusting that even in the midst of suffering, there's a divine plan unfolding.
Exactly.
That we might not fully grasp in the moment.
It's not about immediate rewards and punishments.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we're part of a larger story, and sometimes the most challenging experiences lead to the most profound growth.
Okay, so this is giving me a lot to think about. Reuben's perspective on God's active providence is really challenging my assumptions about how the world works.
It's a paradigm shift.
Yeah, but I have to admit, I'm still struggling with this whole idea of nature not being a separate entity.
Oh, okay.
Doesn't that eliminate the possibility of miracles?
That's a common misconception, and it's one that Reuben addresses head-on.
Okay.
In fact, he argues that the very existence of miracles proves that nature can't be independent of God.
Wait, how does that work?
Okay, so think about it this way. If nature were truly separate, self-governing, then God wouldn't be able to override its laws.
Okay, that makes sense. So the fact that God can perform miracles shows that he's ultimately in control of everything.
Exactly.
Including those things we call natural.
He can bend the rules when he needs to.
Right, it's powerful.
So this brings us to another key point.
Okay.
How can we reconcile this idea of God's active providence with our modern understanding of science?
Right.
Because science seeks to explain the natural world through observation and experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
While religion often attributes events to God's will.
Yeah. Can these two perspectives coexist peacefully?
It's a question that's more relevant now than ever before with all the incredible scientific advancements we're seeing.
It's like a tension that so many people are grappling with.
Absolutely. And Reuben's perspective offers a potential bridge between these seemingly different viewpoints.
Okay.
And remember, he was living in a time when scientific discoveries were revolutionizing the way people understood the world.
So he was already wrestling with these questions centuries ago.
Exactly. He was ahead of his time in many ways.
Oh.
And his approach is surprisingly relevant for us today.
Okay.
He doesn't reject science outright.
Okay.
In fact, he recognizes the importance of studying the natural world, understanding its laws, but he also insists that those laws are ultimately established and governed by God.
So it's not about choosing between science and religion.
Right.
It's about seeing them as complementary, exploring different facets of the same reality.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
Science can help us understand the how of the universe, while religion can offer insights into the why.
This is fascinating. But doesn't this raise questions about free will?
Oh.
Like, if God is ultimately controlling everything, do we really have any choice in our actions?
That's another one of those big thorny questions.
Right.
But remember, Rubin makes a distinction between the different degrees of providence.
Okay.
Universal providence operates through those fixed laws which allow for predictability and consistency.
Okay.
But private hidden providence works in more subtle and often unpredictable ways.
So there's still room for human agency within this framework.
Right. It's not just a simple case of determinism versus free will.
Okay.
It's more about understanding that we have the capacity to make choices, but those choices are made within a context shaped by God's overall plan.
Okay. So we're playing a game with a set of rules.
Yeah.
But we can still choose how we play the game within those rules.
That's a good analogy. And the concept of meisel adds another layer.
Okay.
It suggests that we're born with certain inclinations and potentials, but we can also transcend those limitations through righteous actions and spiritual growth.
So it's not about being locked into a predetermined fate.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we have the power to shape our own destinies in partnership with God.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Rubin's core argument, the rejection of a separate governing nature.
Right.
By emphasizing God's direct and continuous involvement, he's essentially saying that we're not alone in this journey.
We're constantly being guided and supported by a higher power, even when we don't realize it.
That's right. And knowing that God is involved isn't just about comfort. It also has practical implications.
Yeah, I was just thinking that it's been a fascinating journey so far, exploring all these different ideas and perspectives, but I'm ready to get down to brass tacks. How does this understanding of divine providence actually impact our day-to-day choices and actions?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that we'll dive into when we return for the final part of our deep dive into Rabbi Nieto's On Divine Providence.
All right, we're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into Rabbi David Nieto's On Divine Providence. We've gone through his arguments against this idea of a separate governing nature.
Right.
And dug into how he understands God's direct involvement in the world. But how do we actually put this worldview into practice?
Right. It's one thing to kind of grapple with these concepts intellectually, but it's another thing to actually live them out.
Totally. It feels like it should impact how we see the world.
Right.
How we make choices.
Absolutely.
How we react to challenges.
For Rabbi Nieto, or Rubin, as we've been calling him, recognizing God's act of providence, it's not just about winning philosophical debates.
Yeah, it should change our actions.
Exactly. He really emphasizes that this should lead to a fundamental shift in attitude.
Okay.
He's talking about cultivating gratitude, humility, and trust.
So less arguing about the word nature, more about letting this belief actually change us.
If we truly believe that God is orchestrating events, even the mundane ones or the difficult ones, it changes our perspective.
Okay, so instead of getting frustrated when things don't go my way, I should try to see the lesson or the opportunity for growth.
You got it. It's about recognizing that even when we feel most alone or lost, there's a guiding hand leading us.
And prayer becomes so much more powerful.
Yes.
If God is constantly involved, then communicating with him through prayer takes on a whole new meaning.
It's not just wishful thinking.
Right. Yeah.
It's about aligning ourselves with God's will, seeking guidance, expressing gratitude.
It could be really comforting.
Absolutely.
Especially in tough times, knowing that you're not alone, that there's a higher power working things out for you.
He even points to the example of the Jewish community in Mantua, Italy.
Okay.
They faced a lot of hardship after being expelled from the city.
Oh, wow.
And he saw those events not as random acts of cruelty, but as evidence of God's hidden providence.
Okay.
Testing and refining their faith.
So even when things seem really bleak, there's a deeper purpose behind the pain.
A purpose that might not be immediately apparent.
But it can lead to growth and transformation.
It's about trusting in that bigger story that's unfolding.
But it's not always easy to maintain that perspective, is it?
It's tough.
We live in a world where science explains everything.
Right.
And things seem to have natural causes. So how can we reconcile God's active providence with that.
It's a tension a lot of people feel.
For sure.
But remember, Rabbi Nieto was already dealing with this centuries ago?
Right, when science was new.
When scientific discoveries were challenging traditional beliefs.
So how did he deal with this tension?
Well, he offers a really nuanced perspective.
Okay.
He doesn't just dismiss science.
Okay.
He acknowledges that it's important to study the natural world, understand its laws, but he also insists that those laws are ultimately established and governed by God.
So it's not either.
Right.
It's both.
It's about recognizing that they're both exploring different facets of the same reality.
So we can appreciate the beauty of science.
Yes.
But also acknowledge that deeper mystery behind it all.
Like seeing a beautiful painting and appreciating the skill of the painter.
It's about seeing God's hand in everything.
Yes.
From the tiniest detail to the biggest cosmic event.
Living with awe and gratitude.
Exactly.
For life itself.
I think that's a profound takeaway from Rabbi Nieto's work.
It's a call to action.
Yeah, to move past the arguments.
Yes.
And see God in every aspect of our lives.
It's a challenge.
For sure.
But I think Rabbi Nieto's Undivine Providence gives us a good place to start.
It's definitely been eye-opening.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a question.
Yeah.
How can we become more aware of God's active providence in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable?
How can we see his hand even when it's not obvious?
Something to think about.
Hopefully you've gained some insights to spark your own exploration.
Remember, it's not about having all the answers.
Yeah.
It's about staying curious.
Right.
Asking questions and being open to new ways of seeing the world.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking those aha moments that make life so rich and meaningful.